Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, co-sponsored by the HIBAR Research Alliance, also known as the HRA, and the RRBM, Responsible Research in Business and Management. I'm Scott Slovic from the University of Idaho, and I'll be the moderator of today's one-hour event. This is the sixth in our series of HRA webinars for researchers, research administrators, and others who are interested in highly integrative basic and responsive research, or HIBAR. The HIBAR Research Alliance website describes the many activities of the organization. I'd like to encourage interested attendees to visit the website and consider joining our mailing list to receive occasional updates about important meetings and other events relevant to HIBAR research. Before our featured presentation by Dr. Jerry Davis and Dr. Ann Tsui, I would like to explain the structure of today's webinar. We will begin with a quick overview of the HIBAR research concept by Dr. Lauren Whitehead, the director of the HRA. Next, Dr. Davis and Dr. Tsui will speak about the special role of the RRBM network in promoting HIBAR research for approximately 30 minutes. We'll then have 10 minutes or so for Q&A, followed by an opportunity for our presenters to briefly offer their final takeaways. Now let's get started. Dr. Lauren Whitehead is a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of British Columbia. He will offer a brief introduction to the concept of HIBAR and to the HRA before we turn to our presentation.
Thanks very much, Scott. I will just open my screen. I'll just speak briefly about HIBAR research itself and the HIBAR Research Alliance, and most importantly, the connection to the RRBM. So HIBAR research is a class of research, and the easiest way to describe it really is in Venn diagrams. Just very briefly, here's a diagram analyzing projects that are both public, impact-oriented, and discovery-oriented. And there's a kind of an overlap zone of those two ideas called use-inspired basic research. Here we'll label that basic and responsive. So that's one approach. Here's another. In this case, these are projects that have sustained urgency in the form of research that involves societal co-leadership. Another two very good things to combine. They're very powerful and useful. But what if we combine both? In this case, we would have highly integrative projects as a way of describing those on the left, and basic and responsive projects on the right. And that overlap zone in the center is the exciting work that has all four of these characteristics, which are important together because they're powerful together. And we call that zone HIBAR research for highly integrative, basic, and responsive. So the HIBAR Research Alliance is a distributed network of experienced volunteers who are well organized and united in their support of HIBAR research. The goal of the HRA is to increase the prevalence of university HIBAR research from about one project in 20 today to about 1 in 5 by 2030, while improving all types of research. And the reason we would like to do that is we believe it will help universities respond more effectively to societal need, while also increasing the excellence of their fundamental research. So that's the key idea. Now, we're so pleased to welcome our friends from RRBM today because their work is largely synergistic with these four key characteristics of HIBAR research. And I'll just mention that in a little bit of detail and then hand back over to you, Scott. So the first one is discovery-oriented. The research of RRBM seeks new knowledge on key issues in all business disciplines. Second is public impact. This research is solution-oriented, leading to lasting improvements for a better world. We also have societal co-leadership. The work emphasizes trusted, equitable societal collaboration. And lastly, and for a long period of time, sustained urgency. This is achieving long-term objectives by building trust over time through responsible research. So for all of these reasons and links, it's my tremendous pleasure to be here with RRBM. And I think I'll just end on that note, Scott, and hand back to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Lauren. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's two presenters, Dr. Jerry Davis and Dr. Ann Tsui. Dr. Davis is the Gilbert and Ruth Whitaker Professor of Business Administration and Professor of Sociology at the University of Michigan, and he is currently a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Dr. Tsui is Motorola Professor of International Management Emerita at Arizona State University and Distinguished Adjunct Professor of Management at Notre Dame University. They will share their experience in building the RRBM network, a global grassroots movement led by 24 senior scholars aiming to change the ecosystem of business research to be more useful to society. We're hoping that today's presentation will be useful not only to researchers and administrators associated with business schools, but to audience members interested more broadly in HIBAR research. Jerry and Anne, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thanks, Lauren and Scott, for the kind introduction, and to Michelle Mossman, who's doing all the heavy lifting behind the scenes. I'm Jerry Davis from the University of Michigan, along with Anne Tsui from Arizona State and Notre Dame, and a set of other colleagues. I'm one of the co-founders of the Community for Responsible Research in Business and Management, or RRBM. We started RRBM about 5 years ago with a group of colleagues because we felt that there was a disconnect between the kind of research faculty we're doing and some of the most pressing needs of society. And we want to share with you some of the insights that we've gained over the last few years. I'm going to be talking about our diagnosis of what's wrong with the ecosystem around research, and then Anne will describe some of the actions RRBM has taken that are trying to change this ecosystem, and then we'll leave some time for questions after that. So I know a lot of you might not be familiar with business schools. Some of the folks on the call might not have ever set foot in a business school. And so you might imagine that our research is mostly about stenography or typing or bookkeeping or something like that. I want to give you a brief overview of business schools to give you a sense of why I think the lessons that RRBM has learned can have broader application across the university to other units on campus. So business schools spread in the 20th century to train professional managers to operate in major corporations. The functional disciplines in business were also reflected in the way that business schools are organized. So typical business school has departments of accounting, operations, marketing, finance, management, maybe a couple of others. Each of these disciplines has its own scholarly journals, its own norms around tenures, its own way of evaluating faculty. So in that sense, business schools are pretty heterogeneous internally, a lot like the rest of the university. And so in some sense, I think the business school is like a microcosm of what happens more broadly in the university, and that the lessons that we have learned in RRBM can apply more broadly. Quick overview of where we're going. Talk about the promise and the problems, the barriers to doing research with impact, around how we publish, how we reward, the innovator's conundrum, which I'm going to be trademarking on this call. It's not a dilemma, it's a conundrum, why it's hard for business schools to change, and then talk about RRBM as a kind of positive conspiracy to try to change things. So the promise of impactful research is that society and accreditors look to academic research to provide insights to guide policy and practice. I teach at a state university. Our legislature would love to know our brilliant insights to help the economy of Michigan, and we're full of smart people that should be able to help them out. A lot of schools, up to 40% of faculty time is intended to be dedicated to research. Ann and I and Bill Glick claim that something like $4 billion a year is spent on research in business schools, which is not nothing. So you'd think that with tens of thousands of highly qualified PhDs teaching in business schools around the world, we should be able to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals 5 years early and under budget. We've got all of the resources in place to be able to take on big societal problems. So in some sense, I like to think of the business school as an estuary. It's sort of like this fecund area between the fresh water of academia and the salt water of the real world. And we're right there at the interface in this very fecund area. The problem is that sometimes it feels more like just brackish water. And that was the problem that we wanted to take on here. So you might imagine that business school faculty spend roughly half their day on the phone to CEOs telling them what to do. that turns out not to be quite the way things work, at least not me. Maybe Anna has a different experience. But like the rest of the university, business school faculty spend most of their time on research, gathering data, running regressions, plotting revenge on reviewer number 2, and so on. The weird thing about business schools is that the research is primarily funded by student tuition, which limits accountability compared to more grant-funded units. And the measures of faculty work tilt very heavily towards internal measures of impact, counts of articles, counts of citations. The metrics for real-world impact are really problematic. You could look at something like book sales. That's a pretty terrible measure. The best-selling business book in history is Who Moved My Cheese? I am not sure about the research basis for that book, but I personally don't want to take responsibility for that particular work out there. And it's really difficult to change the system because it's dominant in just about every other school that you compete for faculty with. And so it really is this interdependent ecosystem where all the parts fit together. You can't really just change one school or one component of that system. You need to change sort of the whole schmear at once. One of the barriers is the system of journals and the kind of work that they like to publish. Ann and I were both editors of top journals in the world of management, so I have a pretty good insider view of just how hard it is to change this titanic ship. It's not as trivial as you'd think to be able to change what journals publish. In some sense, what journals look like hasn't changed that much since 1665, when the very first journal was created by the Royal Society, publishing some fairly ecumenical articles. But the topics have changed, but the idea of mailing out a journal bound in paper to subscribers still feels pretty consistent. The idea that a journal comes out quarterly, let's say, still feels very consistent. And also the idea that the articles are full of specialized jargon and are really inaccessible to normal people, that also hasn't changed. But ICTs have changed all of that. Information and communication technologies has changed part of the world that we live in. 350 years later, all the world's knowledge is in principle instantly available on my phone. I can find anything in JSTOR or anything in the world. So this should be a great thing. This should be wonderful that our research is accessible to all of the world and all of our undergraduates and to all of us. It is not always worked out in practice, as I'll say in a minute here. One thing that if you don't know any scholars under 40, it turns out that they're all web-enabled scholars. Just like I don't comprehend TikTok, I'm still a little bit mystified by the way young people get at research. No one subscribes to a paper journal. Scholars under 40 universally find the articles online through Google Scholar. The relevant unit of analysis today is the article and not the issue or the journal. You can get individual articles from everywhere, and it's actually hard to tell the difference based on the font between a really good article that is from a credible journal and a really terrible article from a rapacious journal. They just, on the internet, they all kind of look the same. In a sense, it's kind of like iTunes and buying albums. And the ecosystem that this has created is, if you want to get cited, as you do, it helps to be read. And if you want to be read, it's essential that you be discoverable on Google Scholar. And that creates some really bad potential situations. So a clickbaity example here. So in principle, it's great that all the work is accessible. It's led to some pathologies that reward clickbait research. Here's an example from a few years ago. It's a same pair of authors are publishing this essentially similar research using the same data set on the same population. The one on the left came to this conclusion. Our results have shown that consuming a diet rich in fruits and vegetables is associated with better health and health-related behavior. Boring. You can see it's only gotten shared 6 times and it's never going to turn up on Google Scholar. Same authors, same data, very different conclusion. Our results show that a vegetarian diet is associated with poor health, higher incidences of cancer, allergies, and mental health disorders, a higher need for healthcare, and poorer quality of life. As you can see up there in the corner, this is in PLOS One. Within 2 weeks, it had 215,000 views. That's not good. Universities love for their research to be cited. People love it. It can help with people looking your work up on Google Scholar, but this is really a bad thing for our science. We also know that journal editors try various tricks to try to improve their impact factors. Faculty choose topics based on things that draw attention rather than good science. All of this is adding up, to something that we really don't want to do. Second barrier to impact is the rate that we reward. So how does social impact get rewarded in most business schools? The answer is not really at all. Or to be more specific about that, tenure committees apply similar standards across cases, disciplines, and schools with a heavy emphasis on article and citation count. It's really hard to get at social impact. It's really easy to get at Google Scholar. It depresses me as an academic when I look at people's tenure letters and they say, well, here's the number of A publications and here's their number on Google Scholar. I could have done that myself. The point of outside review is that you read the work and engage with it. But something about Google Scholar has created this unfortunate situation that people are deferring to metrics that they really shouldn't. So that's kind of our diagnosis of what's gone wrong and what we might help. We think impact means citations. Impact does not mean citations. There's a lot of ways to game that, and we really don't want to play into that system. So the innovator's conundrum here is that for any individual school, changing standards of evaluation for junior faculty might scare off potential entrants. If we say the way that you get rewarded at our school looks different from every other school, come here, you're going to scare people off. Faculty know that they need to have a resale market. And so if you do something too idiosyncratic, it'll be really hard for you to hire. Therefore, nobody wants to be the one school that changes things. Same thing with journals. If any individual journal changes their criteria for publication, it might alienate the associate editors who got to be board members and editors because they're really good at that old way of doing work. And accreditors can't get too far ahead of their constituents. And so this is really an interdependent ecosystem. All of the parts fit together in a way that makes change really hard to pull off. Our solution is to create what we call a positive conspiracy. RRBM, Responsible Research in Business and Management, is really a positive conspiracy of sets of senior scholars across all the different business disciplines, journal editors, deans, and others to try to change things. Our theory of change is that it takes a movement to change an ecosystem. It takes a social movement to change an ecosystem. It can't just be one field advocating for change. We need accounting, finance, marketing, management, and so on. We need to change what journals do. How do they publish things? Because that's how people get evaluated. So how about special issues to test drive the idea of social impact? Or a badging system for articles that meet standards of responsible research. Eventually, we would love to see evaluation and even tenure standards change to reward people for doing what we call responsible research. What we mean by responsible research is work that produces credible and useful knowledge. It contributes to both science and society. We have a whole bunch of principles. I don't have time to walk through them, but I will paste a link to how you can get at this work separately. And the elements of our basic theory of change, which Anne is going to unpack for you, is recruit top scholars across all the relevant disciplines, including editors and deans, create a position paper, which I will link to shortly, that lays out your case, host engaging summits every year, as we do with this global summit, commission special issues from journals to provide proof of concept, provide rewards for published papers, scholarships, create a recognition system for published papers. And this is a link to some of the things that we've done most broadly. And I want to turn things over to Anne Tsui, and she will describe some of the actions that we have taken at RRBM since we were founded about 5 years ago. So Anne, take us away.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Thank you for the awesome introduction to the background for RRBM. And good day, everybody. I'm very delighted today to share some specific actions that are happening to advance responsible research. And I should mention first that most of the actions or activities are by our partners or members of the research ecosystem. Part of our work is to be the hub of information on any actions taken by any of the research ecosystem stakeholders, actions that are consistent with the mission of RRBM, You can see details of these actions on the RBM website that Jerry was referring to. Due to time constraint, I cannot share them all, but I will highlight a few of them for you here today. So for actions on credibility, we're able to ride the wave of the open science movement started by Brian Nosek at the University of Virginia. A few of the leading business journals are already adopting the open science transparency standards. And editorial policies are introduced to discourage the questionable research practices that we are so familiar with, such as p-hacking or hacking. We hope that the RBM movement has provided further stimulus for the journals to take the replication crisis more seriously and more urgently. On action for relevance, many editorials have appeared discussing the need to integrate practice into research or to join the conversations in society and not only in the literature. We see more and more special issues on timely and urgent topics such as better marketing for a better world, responsible research in operations management, or racial injustice issues in organizations. And one journal asked practitioners to comment on published articles, and that is an innovation. Actions by scholarly associations, and they're very active and taking many actions also. Here are a few examples that we know of or have helped to create. The first is the Responsible Research Award that Jerry mentioned. This award recognizes research published in the last 5 years. The award was introduced in almost all the business disciplines. And we can see the social facilitation effect is working here. One association invited executives to its board. You may not think it is a big deal, but for management, we have pretty much shut out doors to practitioners for more than 20 years. And that's why we have the relevance problem that Jerry is talking about. So RBM is a global movement. The business schools in China are involved in RBM also, many of them are, and they are way ahead of many other countries. Through the orchestration of the incoming president of the International Association for Chinese Management Research, the deans of the top 10 business schools in China made a commitment to transform their schools' research from a focus on publishing papers in international journals to a focus on serving the Chinese society. A few schools have even revised their promotion standards to include publishing in the local Chinese language journals and by solving problems in the Chinese society and rather than Western societies. So actions by accreditation agency, the most noteworthy is probably this one by AACSB, which is an agency that certifies the quality of business schools using accreditation standards developed by inputs from the business schools themselves. The chief accreditation officer was inspired by RBM in participating in a summit, and she decided to make societal impact of a business school's activities front and central in its revision of the standards in 2019. The new standards were approved in 2020 with societal impact as a unifying theme. Journal articles and other intellectual contributions should align with the school's mission. The emphasis is on outcomes and impact of the scholarship produced and not just the count of publications. So the standards further require schools to collaborate with a wide variety of external stakeholders to inform theory, policy, and practice of business. So we have a bunch of ongoing projects. These are some that RBM is working on. So we've held 2 summits, one in 2019, which was in person, and one online in 2020, collaborating with our partners, Rotterdam School of Management and Imperial College London. And next year, in 2022, we're going to be collaborating with the Wharton School. So for 2021, this year, we are planning 2 summits. Both of them are virtual. The first one for academics, which is coming in April, and the second one in June, is going to reach out to the external stakeholders or the societal stakeholders, including business, nonprofit, international organizations, funders, and some media. Our RBM team has been working on identifying metrics that can track the impact of research practices and on policies. It's a very difficult problem, as Jerry has alluded to, and many groups are working on it, and our team is working very hard on this problem in finding solutions. Now, that the movement is beginning to have some traction, we wanted to prepare the doctoral students and help them learn how to conduct responsible research. We held 10 webinars in 2020, and we have many more planned this year. This fall, we will offer an online doctoral course about the philosophical foundation of responsible research. We will roll out soon a scholarship program to encourage doctoral dissertations on justice issues in organizations and all kinds of justice, racial, economic, and so forth. A group of associate deans, led by our own Jury Davis, are discussing how to introduce the necessary changes at the schools. Now, the chance of success is much higher when a group of schools to lead the change together. And this is another good example of the positive conspiracy that Jury was referring to. So what have we learned? RBM began in early 2015. After 6 years, we've had some small successes. So what accounted for these small wins? So in reflecting upon that, I began thinking about our first meeting in Vancouver, 2015. There were 12 of us, full of enthusiasm with lots of energy. Of course, we were all 5 years younger. We knew we were tackling a problem more than 20 years old, that it will be extremely difficult, but we are willing to try. We would take one step at a time, and we would review our progress every year. We said we should be willing to stop the project anytime and not continue to invest in a failing cause. So it is like the Chinese economic reform in the early 1980s. Deng Xiaoping, the architect of the reform, was said to have said the reform to him is like crossing the river by touching the stone. Another river metaphor, one stone at a time, with courage, caution, and steadily. And RBM did the same. So the second learning is about the clarity of our vision and mission. We developed the Vision 2030, like HIBAR, believing that the change may take 15 years, and if shorter, we will be delighted. So we wrote a position paper to clarify our mission. We formulated 7 principles of responsible research, and that is for enhancing both credibility and usefulness of the research findings. We identify the key stakeholders in the research ecosystem. And in the position paper, we discuss how their interconnectedness reinforces the current undesirable practices. We suggest the actions that each stakeholder can take to transform the research practices and priorities, and the need to coordinate and synchronize. The stakeholders become the leverage points for change and the focus of our activities. So what we decide to do and not to do, review our action orientation. In every summit we've held and other activities we have organized, we always try to encourage each participant to make a commitment to take one action afterwards. Last but not least is the quality of the people we have at the RBM community, and especially the working board. The level of commitment among the team members is really impressive and inspiring. Now, this is volunteer work, much like HIBAR or HRA, the outcome of which will bring no benefit to the people involved themselves, except the joy to see good work and meaningful research coming out of business schools. So these are a few key reasons why RBM is still around after 6 years and is having some modest success. We do not have a grand strategy, but step by step, we are crossing the turbulent river and hope in the foreseeable future, we will reach the other bank where the promised land lies. So my concluding remark is that RBM is a temporary movement to kickstart a change that's much needed in business schools. This is a self-correction movement, and not all the parties in the ecosystem agree. Hopefully, threats from the external environment, such as reduced funding for universities and reduced enrollment in business schools, the existential challenges we have in our world today, an internal call for relevance and sound scholarship are propelling this movement. We wish that the change could come faster and broader, and maybe we don't have the right approach, may not have the right best way forward, but through one step, one person, one action at a time, we hope that business research will contribute to a better world in the years to come. So thank you for the opportunity for sharing something of what RBM has been engaged in.
Thank you very much, Anne and Jerry. And Michelle, I wonder if there's a way of placing Anne and Jerry both on the screen so that we can begin a Q&A. You've both presented very interesting, clear, and efficient information about the RRBM. So we have a good 15 minutes or more for Q&A. And I do have some preliminary questions, but also would be happy to receive questions from other attendees if people want to type them in the Q&A box. So I wonder if I could get started. And the questions that I have are not specifically for either you, Anne, or for Jerry, but either one of you or both can respond. I think a number of the people attending our webinar may well be administrators in the field of research administration. And I'm wondering whether there's a specific thing or a few things that university administrators could do to help encourage more RRBM-like efforts in other fields, or even to encourage RRBM further. But what could university administrators do to support the kind of effort that you're doing to create institutional change that will in turn lead to societal change?
I think the idea that research takes place in an ecosystem with a lot of parts that fit together is really important to take into account. So the usual solution for problems is we're going to provide funding for X, and that will solve everything. And so if we just create a fund, people love money, and so they will apply for that fund and they'll do research relevant to that fund. And that's really not in itself sufficient to do it. You can't just pull one lever like funding, because you got to think what's going to get published. Where are junior faculty thinking about their future? Where might they get jobs in the future? What are they going to get promoted for? It's really a whole lot of components that all fit together. And so it's not a simple problem. There's a reason why it keeps sort of reproducing itself year after year, is because we're kind of in an equilibrium situation. And so I think the idea that we all need to sort of clasp hands and jump together, that would be the most important lesson that I feel we've learned. We've taken a lot of specific actions, like do a special issue to prove work like this is possible, and then you can point to it as evidence in the future. But I think that the diagnosis of the ecosystem is really important. Don't think this is a simple thing that'll take a year. It really takes a lot of components together. Anne, did you have other thoughts?
I have lots of thoughts. Great question. By administrators, I'm assuming, Scott, you refer to people in the president's office, the provost office, P&T committee members, and people who control the money, the budget office. So we have to have multi-front readiness to go at this problem. My assumption is the university want the research to be useful for society. And many universities have been called about that you're not producing students or research that really matters for society. So assuming that is the case, then the P&T committee need to look at how do you evaluate faculty in all the schools, okay? The people who control the money, the research office, need to create funds that encourage interdisciplinary research, encourage research that matters to society, and also to not designate the specific journals as the only acceptable outlet for research products. And we know, informed university administrators know that journal citations not mean articles in the journals of that same level of citations or quality. All right, so getting rid of the journalists is really important. Having money to encourage interdisciplinary research is really important. And changes in the tenure promotion committee is really important. All of these ideas are in the HIBAR report that you've created some months ago. So nothing much new here, just to reinforce that same point.
These are not specific to business. These could easily apply to a variety
Yes,
of other
absolutely.
people. I'm receiving some really good and interesting comments and questions in the Q&A box. So let me turn to these. So you've described that this problem in business schools is about 20 years old, but many disciplines have a more deeply entrenched and longer existing set of problems of this type. Do you think that it will make it more difficult to encourage change in these other areas, more deeply entrenched over history, than perhaps business schools? So maybe creating change in business schools is a little bit easier because they're less entrenched, perhaps, than certain other disciplines. Do you think that's so?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. What's ironic is that people imagine that business schools are all about practice. If you're not from a business school, then you might think publishing in Harvard Business Review is a great way to get tenure, or being in Fortune magazine or something. And it's not at all. It mirrors the other disciplines. It's kind of ironic that business schools have sort of drifted from contributions to practice in this way. I can definitely see why certain other core disciplines, not necessarily the professional schools, would have a much more difficult time in changing their orientation. But Lauren, I don't know if you're willing to dive in on this. You might have some sense of, say, is physics much more difficult to change than, say, a professional school?
I'll dive in just to say I don't think I could add much, to be honest. I have had a lot of contact with almost all disciplines, particularly during my period as provost. And I didn't find a lot of disciplinary differences from this perspective. So, Jerry, I think I'm just mirroring your view that throughout the academic world, there are some who just have a difficult time imagining practical benefits being compatible with the most elite academic practice, and many who don't feel that way. But I do think it's quite a common thread throughout the academic world.
Yeah, and I have to emphasize something that Lauren said at the very beginning. The goal of HIBAR, the Research Alliance, is not that all work is directly applicable the next day. It's to move the needle to be more like 1 in 5 rather than 1 in 20 projects. It's not meant to completely reorient how research is done so that all of it has an instant application. It's to sort of move the needle to 20% of the portfolio.
I like to add to this point. I guess one of the major obstacles, as I see, is that we do not know what we do research for. And Jerry, you've written a paper about that. I think most academics, including non-business disciplines, see doing research is to satisfy promotion tenure requirements. It's not to contribute knowledge to society. Okay, once we can really define research is to solving problems of society, producing knowledge that can help us, whether it is in artistic, it applies in all disciplines. So who do you do research for, right? So that's a basic question. We're not clear about that basic question and continue to stay that our research, beginning with doctoral training, we still tell them that research is to make sure you get tenure. And with that mentality, nothing's going to get changed. We have to change that understanding that research is science. Science is about solving problems of society, natural and social. Without that understanding, I think, but I'm seeing some change. Is the question about 20 years is that not entrenched enough. 20 years is a long time to waste our time and talents on. So I don't think that any amount of months and years of days wasted on research that matters to nobody is acceptable. So I think it's a self-reflection, soul-searching exercise that university has to get engaged in order for us to become relevant, contributing members of the society through our privileged positions in universities, getting all the freedom to do what we want to do. And with that freedom, we have to take some responsibility. And we have not emphasized the responsibility part enough. That's why we call it responsible research.
Thank you. Thank you. I see we have a number of other questions lining up, so let me move to them. Listeners are curious to know how well the RRBM has been received to date. For example, Jerry mentioned the risk of not being able to attract new faculty if certain standards are being changed and potential faculty members are not quite sure what standards they'll be judged by in a particular department or school. Has the work of the RRBM or other factors created resistance to its being embraced within the business school community?
I'd say the resistance that we got early on was people saying, well, if what I do doesn't count as responsible research, does that mean that I'm irresponsible? And that really wasn't the vibe that we were going for. I would say we've gotten, particularly from senior faculty, an overwhelmingly positive response. I mean, the shocking thing is you talk to any journal editor and they'll say, yep, I feel the same way. Very senior scholars, as Lauren and I discovered in interviewing provosts, people at the top levels of the university love the idea of responsible research. They would love their work to be applicable. They'd love to be able to go to the state legislature and say, look, we fixed the water problem in Flint, Michigan, thanks to the university. There's not really resistance at that level. It's more at a tactical level that my immediate this year's evaluation is going to be tricky. So I think broadly people buy into the principles. I also am basically optimistic that scholars under 35, I've been really heartened by the level of support that we get from more junior scholars, doctoral students, and particularly junior faculty. A lot of the really very best, interesting, responsible research and award-winning papers are by junior faculty. They've embraced this mission, whether it's going to be rewarded at their school or not.
Yeah, we have the junior people is embraced the idea. We held a bunch of webinars. Many of them had several hundred signed ups. And it's just a overwhelming response to discussions about how to do responsible research, what is responsible research. And one of my recent small wins that I didn't mention is that our award changed hands from one association to now they're in the hands of the fellows of the Academy of Management, the Academy of Fellows have existed since 1956, and they haven't done anything except a dinner once a year. Now they're taking up the awards program. So this is like a gigantic move for that. And that, to me, is like, you can see, witnessing people are more receptive to this idea. So it took a few years. Mm-hmm.
So one of our listeners also raises the point about university ranking and suggests that it would be helpful to create a ranking system based on the criteria that the RRBM is highlighting. And so our listener says that perhaps everything else will follow once university ranking is somehow linked to this idea of social responsibility.
I love that question because this is potentially happening as we speak. So the Financial Times is sort of the Wall Street Journal of Europe. It's pink and it's about finance. So it's a really important paper, and they rank business schools around the world every year, sort of overall and for MBA programs and so on. And they have proposed changing their evaluation of research to be a bigger part of the annual evaluation, say 20% instead of 10%. So making research more central, but also trying to take societal impact more seriously in what those rankings look like. And it turns out that once you say we're rethinking how we do our evaluations, the world goes berserk. Because schools are very calibrated to the existing system of criteria. Financial Times has a list of 50 journals. They count the number of faculty publications in those 15 journals, and that's your score. Very straightforward. Everybody understands that system. If you say we're thinking of changing it, the editors of those journals get very anxious. The people that publish in those journals get anxious. Schools get anxious. It generates a lot of source, frankly. There's a lot of concerns about how this might happen, but they are sincerely asking, the editor in charge is sincerely asking, how would we measure impact better? And it turns out that when the rubber hits the road, it's really difficult to get at the societal impact of research. You can measure rigor by saying, did it meet certain criteria? Did it make the hurdles that high quality journals hold? So that's the rigor part. Relevance, you can use natural language processing to look at does the research that's being reported here link to, say, the UN Sustainable Development Goals? It's what they do at Rotterdam, by the way. Really interesting idea to get at the relevance. Impact, has my work changed the way, has it made a real impact on the society beyond our walls? That's really difficult to pull off. And frankly, we're contemplating the idea of using big data to take on this problem. Could we get at the societal impact of research using big data techniques? Or we're mulling the idea of doing a hackathon in the months to come. So if anybody has the genius cure for how to make university rankings dependent on the positive societal impact of the research, please let me know. We're looking for a silver bullet, but turns out it's not so trivial to do that.
Thank you. Here's another question about the convergent research that the National Science Foundation requires for certain funding opportunities. Wondering whether this kind of idea of convergent research might be particularly relevant to the RRBM and HIBAR principles, and suggesting that there's a kind of a complementary connection between this effort of a government funding agency and what RRBM is attempting to achieve. Do you have any thoughts about that?
There's lots of synergy between some very good ideas within NSF and other funding agencies. And there's really nothing new about the ideas that are being presented here today. But the collection of them, the way they're being presented, and more importantly, the attempt that is being made to actually lead to change within the university system, at least from my perspective, is the new and exciting thing.
Let me turn to something that may be a little bit more germane to business schools in particular. One of our listeners says, often societal impact takes a long time to determine. Sometimes very basic research can have the most societal impact over time. How might some of these ideas, such as factoring it into business school rankings, take into consideration this longer runway?
We fully recognize the time horizon. What we are after is not so much research that have immediate impact. The main thing that we are after is that scholars seriously study problems that are real in the world, that are real important, and not manufacture stories based on a data set that conveniently got a hold of, and to look for most interesting correlations and variables, and then they try to write a paper, or to work on a problem that's been well published in the literature but has no relevance for today's world at all, but it adds one or two more variables to it. There's so much of this kind of incremental, adding a variable, testing another boundary condition, those kind of paper. And we want to discourage paper that has nothing to do with reality. We want scholars to focus on research on problems that's important to society. And whether or not that has impact in the future, that's, as Jerry said, as you said, it's not something we can tackle. Time will tell, but in the short term, we look at the title and then look at the way they do research, whether they engage the end users, stakeholders in a research so that it becomes real rather than another kind of novel writing exercise. That's what we call it.
Thank you. Perhaps we can go to at least one other question from our audience. And this one, it's really a future-looking kind of question, I think, because our listener, who thanks you for such a very nice presentation, says, is there anything PhD students can do to support the RRBM efforts? And maybe this stands for other students, not just PhD students, perhaps MBA students or undergraduates. What can they do to support this sea change within the business school community?
We welcome volunteers. On the RRBM website, there's a page actually says volunteers. So if you would go there, put down your name, your interest, where you study, and then we will be in conversation. The webinars where we held last year in 2020, most of them were organized by a PhD student in the UK. And then we're beginning to roll out a scholarship program. We have several PhD students involved in helping us design that scholarship program so that it could be more sort of speak to a PhD student more directly, understand their needs, and so forth. So yeah, there are many ways you can contribute, but let us know who you are and what you're interested in, and then we can go from there.
So it sounds like you already have students involved in the
Correct.
RRBM.
Absolutely.
And also the RRBM in offering scholarships is attempting to support students whose thinking is moving in the same direction.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Well, here's a similar question. Is there anything business professionals can do to support your work? People out in the business world, maybe outside of academia. In fact, that's a very HIBAR relevant kind of question, because HIBAR encourages, this kind of interaction between people within academia and outside of academia. Any thoughts about what people can do to support the work of the RRBM from outside of the academy?
Well, the first one immediately is that our awards program, your management, responsible research award for published work, we have a review step by executives, by managers. So if you're interested, help us, again, send me or Jerry an email to let us know, and then we can definitely use your help. That's just a short-term, kind of one concrete project that can help you, but there are many other ways, many other ways. And come to our website, endorse our position paper, let us know who you are, send us a note about what you're interested in, and then we will go from there.
I have to add to that a great story from last year's award winners. I got to meet one of the executives who had been one of the judges. They're reading the research and giving their reactions to it. And he said, we had this problem in factories that we work with in India where problems X, Y, and Z were coming up. And I read this paper and immediately implemented the insights that we got from that. So that was Aruna's paper, Aruna Ranganathan, train them to retain them. And he said, I read this thing and said, this is the answer to my problem. And it's now changing lives as we speak. That's got to be super gratifying for a researcher to see their work make a real difference in the world in that way. And our dream is that once people start to see this pipeline, that it doesn't end with Google Scholar, that people will start to be inspired to see, maybe, if I've got these 5 potential projects I can work on, maybe I can lean towards the one that looks a bit more HIBAR, something that's really going to take on an issue that matters. We're kind of living through it right now with the COVID epidemic. Businesses need help. They need to know how to stay safe. I'm a network analyst. I know how I can break up networks most effectively. So I've got some insights that apply there. If we could change the ecosystem to reward work that had that kind of positive impact, where you could get tenure for doing work like that and get rewarded for it, I think we'd all be happier in some sense.
Thank you. And now I'd like to give you a minute or two to offer any final messages, final takeaways from your presentation.
Yeah, so thanks, Scott. This has been super fun for me. I hope people have found it informative. We had a couple of lessons we wanted to take away. One of them is that, as I said, research takes place in a connected ecosystem with a lot of reinforcing parts. If you want to change things, it's got to be a collective effort. It's a collective action problem to change all of these things at once. And the second thing is that changing an ecosystem requires what we call a positive conspiracy. You can't just change one school or funding. You want to change what journal editors do, deans, promotion and tenure committees, senior scholars, and accreditors. That's really hard, but I think we've had some pretty good luck with RRBM in enrolling people from across these different constituencies to take on some of these problems. I think enough people found the mission to be inspiring and encouraging. We've got allies across all of these different components, and slowly but surely, we think we're making some good progress there. And Anne.
Yes, as recruiting allies who really care about the problem is the third point. So we have this 20-60-20 formula. In most change in any group, you can divide the group into 3 parts, roughly 20-60-20 distribution. And that is about 20% of them would agree with you, they support you, 20% would vehemently disagree with you. They just don't believe the change is necessary or in fact harmful. And 60% are in between. So focus on those in a 20 positive group and invite them to join us. Then focus on winning as many of those in the 60% group as possible. Once the positive group becomes a majority, then you have it. So we focus on those who really care about the problem. So the next takeaway is that, remember, you can't solve every problem all at once, okay? So we try to have deep understanding of the nature of the problem to be solved, focus on the big goal. So be both, in my suggestion, be both realistic and idealistic. So set high aspirations so people can be excited about the vision. but be realistic about what you can do with limited resources. Be prepared to let go of some projects, maybe the timing is not right, and be happy with the wins, no matter how small. And so the last point is that small wins can add up if you are persistent. So be patient and take what you can get, but never stop looking for bigger opportunities. We hope the RBM experience offers some practical ideas and some perspectives in your own efforts or considerations about introducing system change. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Jerry and Anne, and thanks to everyone who's attended today's webinar. I'm sure that people from a variety of disciplinary perspectives have found something valuable in what you've said. So thanks to all of you, and please stay tuned for announcements of future events in this series.